So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rogers Memorial Library. My name is Penny Wright. I'm in charge of adult programs here, and we are so delighted that tonight has finally arrived. It actually wasn't that long ago, as you well know, that it was cooked up. Joe Shaw and I talk frequently about hosting events together, and we have had a couple of events, sort of round tables, but one of our situations is that Joe sort of works on a weekly deadline, and we work 3 or 4 months ahead, so sometimes we aren't able to coordinate. But Joe has long admired Bill Keller, as have I, and we ran into each other a couple of weeks ago, and he thought that we might be able to get him here, that he might be able to invite him here, and that Bill Keller said yes, so here we are doing something that we are very happy to be doing. I will tell you a couple of things about Joe. For those of you who don't know Joe Shaw, he is the executive editor of the Express News Group, the newly formed company that owns the 3 editions of the Southampton and East Hampton Press and the Sag Harbor Express. To get used to that new Express News Group title. Yeah. Both the Press and the Express have been recognized as among New York State's and the nation's best community newspapers. And the 2 papers have won hundreds of state awards for news, commentary, photography, design, and digital presentation. A native of Pittsburgh, a city that he talks about lovingly.
I have my Steeler cufflinks on.
The point of annoyance. No.
I wrote that, by the way.
Joe has been at the Press, or should I say the Express, for 21 years, and is only the 8th editor of that newspaper in its history. That's quite something. Please welcome Joe Shaw.
Thank you.
So the reason we're all here tonight is to have a conversation between Joe and his colleague and friend, much admired friend, Bill Keller. And I will tell you a little bit about him. Bill Keller was, until April of this year, the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit independent news organization launched in 2014 that focuses on crime and punishment in the United States. He was its founding editor, and the Marshall Project became the youngest news organization to win a Pulitzer Prize, as well as other prizes for reporting, design, and general excellence. Before that, he spent 30 years at the Times as a correspondent, editor, and op-ed columnist, and from 2003 to 2011 as its executive editor. During his tenure, the New York Times won 18 Pulitzer Prizes and expanded its audience by adapting the newsroom to the journalistic potential of the internet. Before becoming executive editor and after completing his tenure in the newsroom, Mr. Keller had been a columnist for the Times op-ed page and a senior writer for the New York Times Magazine. He also served as managing editor, foreign editor, and as chief of the Times Bureau in Johannesburg from 1992 until 1995, when he covered the end of white rule in South Africa. And for 5 years before that, Mr. Keller was a Times correspondent in Moscow, reporting on the ultimate collapse of communist rule and the breakup of the Soviet Union. In 1989, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage. Before coming to the Times, if there was such a, if there could be such a time, Mr. Keller was a reporter for the Dallas Times Herald, the Congressional Quarterly Weekly Report in Washington, and the Portland Oregonian. He graduated from Pomona College in 1970 and is an emeritus trustee member of the college's Board of Trustees. Bill Keller lives in mostly Southampton and sometimes New York with his wife, who is with us this evening, Emma Gilby Keller, and their daughters, Molly and Alice. It is such an honor to have you here tonight. Please welcome Bill Keller.
Thank you for being here, Bill. Appreciate it. Looking forward to this. And thank you to everybody who turned out to fill the entire room on a sunny Thursday in summer in August, which is pretty amazing. Before we start, I just wanted to offer a couple of observations. And by the way, we are going to have time at the very end to allow people to ask some questions. We do ask you to ask questions rather than making a lot of statements, if that's possible. And we would like it if we could keep the questions brief so we can cover as many as we possibly can. So we'll leave a little time at the end for that. But I wanted to point out that when we announced this event, it's called Truth in the Time of Trump, we took a lot of heat on social media. The reaction pretty immediately was negative from a lot of people who said, it sounds like it's just going to be an opportunity for some more Trump bashing from the media. And I thought that was kind of a symptom of the problem that we're here to talk about today. And it's also imperative for how important it is for us to have these kinds of conversations, because it shows just how much the distrust in the media is breeding contempt for the media. And I think we need to have adult conversations, and this would be one of them. And I think we should not be afraid to have adult conversations, and we shouldn't be afraid to have them publicly. So, that's what I want this to be, is an adult conversation. I don't want it to be about bashing the president, but I want to talk about how, as an industry, we in general have to respond to it. And by the way, Bill Keller has spent his entire career in international journalism. I haven't, but I can tell you that this response to the media and this distrust of the media filters down to the local level. And I mean, we have been tagged with fake news as much as anybody on, in the industry. So it is a problem that I think goes top to bottom in our industry. So I guess my first question, Bill, is that in the time of Trump, is there a crisis that we're facing in our industry? I mean, is our premise legitimate?
The short answer is yes, but we didn't gather here for the short answer. I'm going to give you a sort of roundabout answer to that question. The week after the 2016 elections, I got a call from Jim Schachter, an old friend from the New York Times, who at that point ran the WNYC newsroom, the public radio station in New York City. And he said, my staff is having an existential crisis. Would you come talk to them? And I don't often get invited to play the role of Dr. Phil, but of course I said yes, and I went, and it was a room full of despair. I mean, first of all, they were castigating themselves for not having seen the outcome coming. Everybody assumed we would be inaugurating the next President Clinton. How could we have missed that story? How could they have voted for the guy that we reported on his sexual peccadillos and his financial double dealing and his phony university and his divisiveness? How could they have voted for him? And how are we going to cover a guy who regards the media as the enemies of the people? And I don't recall exactly what I said, but I hope it was something like this. First of all, grow up. I mean, you are about to cover what for most of you will probably be the biggest story of your lives. I've covered some big stories, and there is nothing as thrilling as covering a society in transformation, which is what we seem to have here. So whether you regard him as a menace or the Messiah, he is going to be fascinating to watch. The second thing is, because people can't take their eyes off of him or stop listening to him, because he draws huge enthusiastic crowds, people are going to want to read about him. And he may, as much as he likes to talk about the failing news industry, he may be part of its salvation, because people are going to want to read and watch and listen to what's going on with this guy. And third, we already know from the campaign that this is a president at war with his own administration. He has no respect for the State Department, the Pentagon, or the intelligence community. His own staff is constantly engaged in sniping at one another. That means that everybody in this new administration is going to be leaking like a sieve, and that's God's gift to reporters. The one thing that I cautioned against was, Steve Bannon, Trump's erstwhile advisor, described the press as the opposition party. And I told the reporters at WNYC, don't let that happen. Don't slip into the role of the liberal alternative or the pro-impeachment party, or you've got to cover this guy with the same degree of fairness and attempted balance as you would have covered any other president.
Do you think we've been largely successful at doing that?
I think we get a mixed grade, honestly. He provokes us deliberately, and a little too often the news media fall for it. He uses outrageous statements to change the subject when the subject is something he doesn't like. He uses it to then, after you write about whatever petty comment that he's made, then he can retweet it and take off on you, and nobody ever gets back to whatever the really important issue of the day was. So, and I think during the campaign, there was a kind of trend the summer before 2016 election day. It started out, the stories would say, Donald Trump says X, Hillary Clinton says Y. And then it kind of evolved into Donald Trump says X, but actually, which is, I think, where we should be. But sometimes it sort of morphed over into Donald Trump says X, and we all know he's a liar. I've used the L word a few times regarding this president myself, so I wouldn't banish it entirely, but you want to be careful about seeming to be name-calling. And there was a lot of talk about when Trump advised the 4 congresswomen to go back to where they came from about how to characterize those remarks. I would say most of the mainstream, certainly the coastal media, just flat out called it racist.
Mm-hmm.
The Times did not, and I haven't talked to anybody at the Times about what conversations they had, but I thought that was an exercising of the kind of restraint that makes it very hard to portray you as the opposition party.
Mm-hmm. How unprecedented is this? We heard your resume, and you've been through numerous administrations and foreign postings, and I mean, is this really that unusual? I mean, you were called to the White House and threatened with treason charges by a former president. You have had combative relationships with the occupant of the White House. Is this just another example of that?
No, I don't think so. I think this is a qualitatively different presidential administration.
How so?
I would say it's unprecedented in America. You could probably come up with some examples of Trumpism in other countries. How so?
Yeah, how's it unprecedented? What's the nature of it that's so unprecedented?
I don't recall that there's ever been a president who was so preoccupied with his own self and how he's portrayed. There's a kind of narcissism I'm not qualified to diagnose psychological disorders, but narcissism seems to stick pretty clearly. And we were not going to engage in any Trump bashing.
And I want to sort of pull back on that a little, except to say that is it possible to say in some realm that the president actually is using the media to his advantage in kind of a way that he has to at least be respected. He's got a plan, and he is baiting the media and using the media at times. But I think it's by design. I don't think it's just incompetence.
No, I don't either. I mean, I think he has I don't know if it's quite a plan, but he has an instinct for how things play, how the media works. I mean, he's done very well by the media.
So then we have to come to the central question here, the philosophical question, where we talk about truth in the time of Trump. So I don't want to get all philosophical, but what do we mean by truth? Because I feel like at the very heart of this conversation is the changing nature of what truth means, especially when it comes to journalists and reporting. And I want to give an example, and we talked about this earlier. It was just recently, it was on August 6th, the New York Times, which I need to do the disclaimer, you're no longer with the New York Times, so I'm not asking you to answer for their choices here. But the New York Times ran a headline on a story that said, Trump urges unity versus racism. And that went out on their first edition on Tuesday, August 6th. And almost immediately, Democratic candidates and others began criticizing the Times for that headline. And they actually pulled the headline and ran for the second run and online and for the rest of the printing. The headline became, Assailing Hate, but Not Guns. The critics were saying that the original headline made Trump look too presidential. But what threw me about this whole conversation is Trump urges unity versus racism is exactly what he did. His quote was, in one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. That is objectively a truthful headline. And yet the Times actually apologized for that headline, even though it's truthful. And I'm really having a difficulty wrapping my brain around those complexities that we face in our industry now. What was your reaction to that?
I cringed a little at the headline. I understood what the response was. I would say the response was a little oversensitive. I mean, I try to think of an analogy. Imagine that Bernie Sanders announced at one of his rallies that his plan would enable him to balance the federal budget in 2 years. And you wrote a headline that said, Sanders vows balanced budget in 2 years. Well, technically that's true. He did say that. But there's a measure of skepticism missing from that headline that most people would find just a little off. I mean, the first lesson of this episode is that it's really difficult to cram a complex thought into a print headline.
That was also my other reaction was, those are people who've clearly never written headlines.
Right.
And headlines are difficult things to capture a story. But I still...
But on the question of truth,
Yes.
I think of truth as an aspiration. It's like perfection. You don't ever quite get there, except maybe Roger Federer or... truth is not just, I mean, facts can be true, but the truth, when journalists talk about in the high-flown notion of the truth, they're talking about facts plus context, plus an underlying narrative, plus word choice. Truth is complicated, and newspapers, news organizations are run by human beings who get things wrong, who get things slightly off. But truth is what you aim for, and that means that you test your premises, you are careful about your sources, and you try to establish an understanding of what the sources know and how they know it, and how trustworthy they are. You look for bias. You try to root out bias or suspend your bias. Approach things with an open mind. It's not as simple as just saying this is a true fact.
It's all. Is it also partly that the nuances are so much greater? I mean, they're not really nuances anymore when we're reporting what's being said versus what we know to be factually true in some cases. That puts a real challenge on journalists because we're not really built to debunk open mistruths. We're built to add context and shade facts in order to find a truth, as you said, in search of a larger truth that the facts might not deliver on their own. But that's a really different thing whenever somebody is saying something that's opposite of what the facts show. Fair enough?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest changes in journalism in my lifetime, maybe in the last 15 years or so, and one that's been accelerated dramatically under the Trump administration, is inserting the facts, the actual facts, into the story in a fact-checking, basically. We now fact-check stories in real time, and we call out the speaker, not just the president, but any speaker who says something that's just demonstrably not true. That's a big change. We were always sort of hesitant to do that, and as a result, sometimes stories came out that suggested a moral equivalency between two points of view. You can carry that too far.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I know the Washington Post likes to hand out the Pinocchios.
Right.
And they do that across the board for lots of, really anybody who makes statements that are verifiable and
You'll see,
can be checked.
every day, or it seems, you'll see stories along the lines of President Trump said such and such, parentheses, this is not true,
Mm-hmm.
or the truth is. That's a relative novelty in the mainstream media, and a healthy one if you don't turn it into an opportunity to stick a knife in somebody.
How do you know where that line is, though? That's the question. Because I agree with you. I think there's an imperative for journalists to fact check, even the president. But anytime you insert yourself into that headline or that story by saying, however, that's not true, I think there is sort of a feeling from a reader that you're imposing and you're no longer objective. When I hear from people who are critical of the news media, they always say, just tell me facts. Don't interpret them for me, just tell me facts. But your point, which I try and explain, is that facts are not always enough. You need context and you need to understand the shading, because facts can be misleading from time to time.
Right, and the volume of misinformation, false information, made-up information that comes out of this White House is extraordinary. And I think there's a way to call people, and again, not just the president. The Times and the Post and other places fact-check the Democratic debates, for example. I applaud that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back, if you go and read them, it's not yeah, we caught you. They make a distinction between things that are misleading and things that are outright false, and supply essentially footnotes so that you can check it out yourself if you have doubts.
I'm curious, the Washington Post has very publicly had a running count of lies and falsehoods from President Trump since the start of his administration. And I don't even know what the number is at this point, but I think it topped 10,000 at some point. Mm-hmm. Is that helpful? I mean, does that start to cross a line into that it's not necessarily doing the job that the media is supposed to do, which is set the record straight? It's more about making a larger point in a negative way.
Yeah, I think as a one-off, when you hit the 10,000 mark, it's worth noting. It's worth noting as a gimmick, but to do a running count is a little, it's not just a matter of being insulting to the president, although the office deserves respect, but you're insulting 40% of the electorate who still support him.
Mm-hmm. How much of what we see in the changes, in the challenges in our industry, were already in motion before President Trump was elected? I mean, a lot of the things we're talking about, mistrust and skepticism about the media, and even the polarization, the president's election, I think, is sometimes a symptom of that as much as it was a cause. How much of that is true in as far as the impact on our industry, which was changing fairly significantly even before President Trump rode the escalator down and declared his candidacy that day?
Yeah. You know, when they do polling on rating various institutions in society as held in high favor or not, Congress always comes out sort of at the level of pond scum. But if you ask people not what do you think of Congress, but what do you think of your congressman, they tend to be much more positive. I mean, we elected him, he's our guy, he filled the potholes, he did what he was supposed to do. And I think you have to make a similar distinction when you talk about media. Media rate, as if you ask people, do you trust the news media, the level of trust is right down there with Congress in that pond. But if you ask them, what do you read, and do you trust the media that you read or that you consume, people are much more favorable. So, I think New York Times readers tend to be incredibly loyal, and Fox News viewers tend to be incredibly loyal.
And the New York Times has kind of always they've always fought the idea that there's a liberal lean. Not just, I mean, it predated you and it followed you as well.
Yeah. I used to always say that, when I was there, we began this process of hiring an ombudsman for 2 years stints, independent space in the paper to write about what the paper was doing right or doing wrong. And our first ombudsman wrote a column that had the headline, "Is the New York Times a liberal newspaper?" And the first word of his column was, "Yes, it is." But if you went on to read the column, he said it's not really liberal in the sense that it supports all Democrats or that it puts partisan propaganda into print. It's culturally liberal, as you would expect of a major newspaper coming out of New York, which is a culturally liberal environment. I think that's kind of true. I wish people read beyond that headline.
Well, you're here now, and you ran the Times for years, and it's a chance to sort of give a little insight into just how much a journalist, and let's talk about the executive editor all the way down to a reporter writing the story. How much do your personal feelings about that story influence the way you report that story, the way you present that story, the way you write a headline for that story? Is there a pure objectivity that you think happens at any newspaper? But I'm talking about during your time at the Times.
Right. During my time at the Times, if anybody is having trouble getting to sleep tonight, if you Google Bill Keller and Glenn Greenwald, you'll find about 5,000-word email debate that the two of us had. Glenn, who started The Intercept, believes that journalists should declare their biases right up front in any major story they write. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And I think that's fine for op-ed writing, but that there is a real virtue to not declaring your personal sentiments. Not because they don't, at some level, potentially influence what you write, but because there's a discipline in being able to withhold your own judgment and go with the facts and the context. I think that's what judges do in courts. They may not like the look of that defendant, but they apply the law. It's what most people do in business. You know, you may find the person you're doing a deal with repulsive, but you do the deal because that's the job. Likewise, in journalism, I think reporters should suspend judgment until they've gathered as much information as they can and then assemble it in as honest a format as they can. Do we always do that? No. Do personal opinions leach into what should be straight news copy? Yes, for sure. And to some extent, that's been worsened by the frequency, I think, the personal opinion, with which mainstream news reporters get called into cable TV chat shows or are expected to go on social media where there are no guardrails. There are no editors telling you you can't say that. And so they feel freer to, express an opinion.
That comes down to a point that I was going to ask you about, is part of the problem that our industry lacks discipline in the way you're talking about compared to 20 years ago. That I think the internet, that's been one of the ways that the internet has changed our industry for better or worse. I think a lot of journalists just don't have nearly that discipline to follow the facts and not chase the facts in a direction you want them to go to not herd them, but to actually follow them.
Yeah, and that's human nature, but that's why God invented editors. To police that kind of, impulse. I mean, there's some people, including some of my friends from the New York Times, who have learned to apply the same kind of discipline and restraint when they're being talked to, and one of the morning talk shows, and then there are others who have crossed the line. And I know there's been stories about reporters being disciplined for going on Twitter and ranting.
Mm-hmm. And the ubiquity of cable TV news too, which I try and tell people is not the same thing as journalism with a capital J. It's journalism and entertainment folded together, and that has to be taken into consideration. But it's really alarming to me, the number of people, when you look at surveys, who only get their information from television news and cable shows and talk shows.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of stuff lately about media literacy, which has become a popular offering in a lot of elementary schools, and more power to them. And I ran across a lot of academics have sort of lists of tests to apply to decide whether your story is fake news or real news. And I read one from an academic who had 4 or 5 things to do to make sure that you're getting the genuine article and not somebody's propaganda. I think number 3 on the list was, don't watch cable TV. I nodded sympathetically with that.
Because it's about ratings to a large degree, and
right.
With newspapers it's a little different. But I've found it interesting that so much of the reporting that goes on in television news and broadly on the internet starts with newspapers. A lot of people say, oh, I don't get my news from newspapers, but the truth is the waters all sort of flow back to the reporting that's done at dailies and community newspapers. That's really where a lot of television news and a lot of internet websites really just repackage what's already been reported by someone else.
Right.
But that can be dangerous too, because you don't know the sources, you don't know how good that information is.
No, we could all use a big course in media literacy, I suspect. They used to call it civics, I think.
Yeah, that was.
Remember way back when.
And I know news literacy is actually something, I believe Hampton Bays High School is talking about introducing a program there as well. And Stony Brook University is one of the places where that really started. I was lucky enough to teach in that program for a couple of semesters, and it really is about teaching consumers that you have an active responsibility engaging in the news, that the news is created by human beings, and you have to have a filter yourself because you can't always trust the filter.
Yeah, we have an audience problem. I mean, I don't mean to shift all of the blame to the victim, but I shift a little of the blame to the victim. I mean, we have, and again, it's easy to blame the internet for all of our ills, but to generalize grossly, we have an audience that has shorter attention spans, expects to get the story instantaneously, expects the opinions that pop up on their social media accounts to agree with them, and by the way, expects this all to be free. That poses a serious dilemma for people who are trying to deliver straight, usable information to a democracy.
And you were in charge of the Marquee newsroom at a time when the industry was dealing with this, that the arrival of the internet really did start to change the rules as far as it became about speed as much as it was about verifying information. I think the Times always hewed really closely to the line of we're not putting anything up until we know it's accurate, and therefore the Times was criticized for being behind on some breaking stories, that when others were publishing rumors and reports from the scene and eyewitness accounts, the Times would sit back, sort through that, and really try to find the facts in the case, which are often elusive in those breaking news situations. That was your strategy, am I correct? That during that time, that was a conscious decision that was made?
Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the recently former publisher, deserves a lot of credit for having recognized early on that we were going to have to essentially marry the internet. We couldn't rebuff it and ignore it. And so we began doing things like set up a sort of rewrite desk that so reporter X is covering the Arab Spring in Egypt, and it's a running story and everybody wants to know what's going on. The foreign desk calls up and asks what's happening, and you offer the reporter some choices. You can do the old-fashioned way, wait till you've finished your reporting, file a full-blown story, it'll be in tomorrow's paper and up on the website after everybody's gone to bed. Or you could give us a short version, with what you know so far, or you can talk to a rewrite desk. And the rewrite guy will do the fact-checking, and you provide the on-the-ground scene. And that worked pretty well.
That was the beginning of digital first.
That was the beginning of digital first.
Yeah, which is a key word in newsrooms all over, including ours. That it's about thinking first about how you're going to present information online, because that's the immediate way that people get their information now. That instead of putting the print product first, and that was really you were at the forefront of that.
Yeah, I mean the pivotal moment in the day of the New York Times newsroom used to be the page one meeting, which would happen at 4 o'clock, and editors would come in and pitch their stories that they thought belonged on the front page, and then they would adjourn, and a small cabal of the top editors would design a page. They don't even have a page one meeting anymore.
Is that right?
They have meetings to talk about what they're covering, but they're in the morning mostly, and they're interested in the web, and they kind of regard the print product now as a version of the real New York Times, which is the one online.
That's really fascinating. One of the things that the Times started to do, and I believe it came after your tenure, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be, is a new feature now that I see in major newspapers all over the country, especially when there's a breaking news story. And it's what we know about this and what we don't know about this incident.
Yeah.
Is that a good development?
Yeah, I think it is.
Why do you think that helps?
Because it makes the story, first of all, because it's right, and it's I think you generate a certain amount of respect if you own up to what you don't know. It helps establish the credibility of the news organization.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I like that the Times did for a while, they haven't done one recently, is on a big issue they'll call a range of opiners, people who are pro, left, right, center, and ask them to make their best case, not slogans, but argue the point. I think we could use a lot more of that. Just
Fewer sound bites and more.
well, you talked earlier about having an adult conversation about these issues. That's a sort of incremental version of an adult conversation.
That even happens at the local level because we have begun asking tougher questions and giving candidates at debates more time to answer, and we've gotten good feedback from the audiences that they like that. They want more information, and they want to hear from the candidates rather than just looking for sound bites.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the Marshall Project and how that fits into sort of the future of journalism. And it's about the search for truth, first and foremost, I think, because your mission really is about investigative journalism. And I feel like that is at its heart what we do that's most important. And can you talk a little bit about how the Marshall Project is different and how it may be a pathway forward for the industry?
Yeah. Do people here know what the Marshall Project is? No? Okay. Marshall Project is about 5 years old. It was started by a man named Neil Barsky, who had been a Wall Street Journal reporter and then started a hedge fund and got rather wealthy and decided he wanted to give back. He grew up in a civil rights family, and so he looked for ways to he recognized that a lot of news media were not covering issues of criminal justice because they're complicated, and newspapers were laying off reporters anyway. And so he put up the initial seed money, rounded up a lot of other donors, and started a nonprofit newsroom called the Marshall Project. He invited me to come be the first editor of it, and we hired mostly young reporters, a couple of experienced reporters, and started doing that. And in the 5 years, I stepped down as the editor in April. I'm still on the board. And we have, we've gone from a budget of practically zero to about $8 million.
And it's a nonprofit.
It's a nonprofit and nonpartisan. It has a sense of mission, which is not the same as an advocacy agenda. The sense of mission being that the system should be more humane, more fair, more effective. And we publish stories on, we're not a web-first organization, we're a web-only organization. But we also partner with other news organizations to get a larger audience. Sometimes that means we just give them our stories. Sometimes we collaborate with other news organizations on coverage. And in fact, last count, we had partnered with upwards of 130 news organizations, from the Times and Post and Wall Street Journal to a lot of local newspapers and about any magazine you can name.
And when you say partner, what do those partnerships look like?
It's a range all the way from you can reprint our copy, which more initially people, wanted to have a hand in shaping the copy before they published it. They're still obviously it goes through their editors. but it ranges all the way from just publishing more or less what we reported to another extreme, two reporters from, we'll put in a reporter, they'll put in a reporter or a videographer or something, and they actually start the story and finish it on their together. And then there are places in between where we provide a story and they provide the video or an interactive graphic or some data work. That's probably the most profound change in newsroom culture of the last 20 years, is this willingness to collaborate with organizations that you would think would be competitors. And it's really helped pump a little fresh life into some newsrooms that were decimated.
Do you think it's a way forward?
Yeah, not the way forward. The first major success at nonprofit investigative journalism was ProPublica, which is run by people I regard as friends. We've hired people from them, they've hired people from us. They're bigger and older than the Marshall Project and quite successful at it. I mean, I think, 25 years ago when Craig Newmark started Craigslist, that was the kind of beginning of the apocalypse for the news media as we knew it. A lot of newspapers relied on classified advertising for up to 40% of their revenues, and suddenly there was this big sucking sound, and all of that stuff was free online. Selling your car, hiring employees, and that's only grown. So with 40% of their revenues gone, it's not hard to understand why in the last 15 years, 2,000 local newspapers have closed. I tend to be an optimist by nature, and I can see a number. I don't know quite what the future of journalism looks like, but as a business model. But one of them will certainly be what I think of as the oligarch model. A rich guy who wants to own a newspaper or a news organization, and you hope that person has high standards, ethical standards. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and so far I have a lot of friends there. They say he keeps his hands off it. Mike Bloomberg owns Bloomberg News. The LA Times is now has its oligarch owner.
And that was sort of the model for newspapers all over the country at one time.
Once upon a time.
It was family owned.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's one option. A pay model where people subscribe and actually have to give a credit card works for the Times, thanks in part to the Trump bump that they've got in circulation.
Which he's happy to point out, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think there are some places that either serve a geographic niche or a thematic niche, if you will, that can make it as a subscription service. Some of the online news organizations like BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, some of them may make it. And then there are the nonprofits, which I think will be seems to be already a growing sector of the news business.
It's supplementing everybody else, the efforts of everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think we deserve the criticism we get in general in a universal sense when we talk about media, when we talk about journalism? There's a lot of skepticism, a lot of criticism. Do you think we deserve it?
Some of it. You have to kind of pick apart what you mean by media. I've already taken a shot at cable TV, so I'll leave them alone. But there's if all I was exposed to was Breitbart, I would probably say the media was scandalously propagandistic. That is not all I read. I read a lot of different things, including occasionally Breitbart. And I think with all of its flaws, we still are the glue that holds the democracy together. And people have to know what's going on in their government, what the government is doing and why. They have to know how the economy works. They have to know what their fellow citizens are going through. And that's all that holds us together.
So where do we go from here then? What's the answer to try and address the challenges that we have in this unique, unprecedented time?
Mandatory media literacy courses from 3rd grade through 8th. No.
I like that idea, actually.
I do. I don't like the mandatory part necessarily, but no, I think a lot could be done in the education field to make people critical readers. We talk about critical thinking. Critical reading should be a natural component of that. I think the news organizations that I would regard as trustworthy, not perfect, but trustworthy, should keep doing what they're doing. I mean, our industry went through, it's probably not over yet, a huge transformation as a result of the internet, and then a sort of follow-on transformation as a result of social media, which meant that everybody was a publisher, or could be a publisher. And the news organizations that will survive and carry the standards and values that I think you and I share, I think they absolutely have a future, as long as they're nimble enough to adapt to the technology and aware of, that the 20-year-old audience is different from the 50-year-old audience. As long as they master the skills that, my daughters don't read a print newspaper. One of them reads the New Yorker in print, but they don't read anything in print really. But you don't say, well, we're going to have to make them read print newspapers or we'll write them off. You come up with a medium, but always holding on to the values that you are aspiring to be truthful.
Okay. Folks have questions? Anybody have questions? I want to give you, can you come up to the microphone? Again, questions please, rather than statements, if we can have that.
Yeah, the other thing is if you could limit your time to around 30 seconds, if you can.
And we'll do this for...
Question or comment disguised as a question.
Bill, if you would speak to the issue of future of network broadcast news. I'm thinking of the quote of Mark Twain, that rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. That's true in a renaissance of some newspapers. But what about broadcast news, its future, what works, what doesn't?
I don't feel qualified to answer that. I watch very little network news. I sort of fell out of the habit when the network news happened to be when I was still at work. So other people watched on the editor's behalf.
Where do you get your news?
My first port of call in the morning is NPR, which I listen to in the gym. I do watch cable. I've started to wean myself away from the morning cable shows because they seemed so redundant, but I would flick back and forth between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. I felt an obligation to watch a certain amount of Fox and Friends every week, just to kind of inoculate myself. On Saturdays and Sundays, I read the print version of the New York Times. Don't tell them, but I mostly read it online now. I do love the print paper, but I don't have time. I read a lot of stuff online, Washington Post, some Wall Street Journal, magazine writing. And I subscribe to a bunch of what are called aggregators, people who tell you, here are 5 things that you should take a look at. Some of them are just flat news aggregators. This happened. The Times and the Post both put out good aggregators. Some of them are more specialized. The Marshall Project has a morning newsletter, which I read, gathers together all the news and commentary from around the country on criminal justice issues. Network TV doesn't have a place in that's nothing, not against it, it's just a habit that I lost.
Another question?
Yes. The title of this talk was Truth in the Time of Trump, but I wonder if the media hasn't missed the fact that the nature of what is considered truth was changing a lot before Trump came on board. And it's been around for a very long time. And I wonder if you feel that the media missed that story, number one, and why are they still missing it? Actually today's New York Times had a very important article about that. But it's been around for years that especially on the web, that there's as much misinformation as information, and people seem to think that's fine.
When you say the nature of truth has changed, it sounds like you're referring to the mix of truth and untruth, that the truth is being crowded out by misinformation.
Yes, exactly, and people don't seem to have the same definition of truth that those of us who read the New York Times have as a definition of truth, as they always put it.
But that was beginning before.
Way before Trump.
Yeah, I
Way
agree with
before
you.
Trump.
I agree with you.
2009, 2010. And I wonder why the media hasn't picked up on that story in a serious way, and also if you have any thoughts as to why is that so?
Because in the why is it so part is in part because in the small c non-political use of the word, the mainstream media tend to be conservative about change. That's why a lot of mainstream media were late to the internet. And I think probably it's true that we didn't see it coming. We being the kind of places that I worked. But there are plenty of examples of bloggers and sort of early pioneers of the new journalism that did see it coming. Their voices just weren't loud enough.
It's interesting because preparing for this talk, I thought I had a great anecdote about facts and how facts can sometimes be misleading, and it was going to be about a Fox News report that had said food stamps, the frauded food stamps were at an all-time high, and they gave a figure of $70 million without giving the context that it's a $70 billion program, and so it's 1%. But then as I started to follow that wormhole down, I found out that even the correction was mistaken, and there was some debate about whether it was 70 billion that they said or 70 million. And then I found out that the actual rate of fraud in food stamps has been declining since the 1990s. And so it actually totaled nearly $1 billion over 3 years. So they actually understated the problem while missing
it.
And I finally just gave up, but it demonstrates that even in search of something as simple as that, it got frustrating to the point where I couldn't develop that into anything coherent. But maybe that's as strong a statement as we can make about the nature. I think the internet changed everything because you get good and bad and wrong and right, and it's all sort of served up in a buffet that you have to try and sort through yourself.
Thank you, Joe and Bill. My question is for Bill. By the way, I also went to Pomona College.
Good for you.
I live in England, and my question is going to ask you to possibly comment on, from your international experience, because we're talking about truth in the time of Trump. but with Boris Johnson now in number 10 and with Trump in the White House, my question is, journalists did not see, the media did not see the Trump story coming, as you've said, but a lot of us saw Boris Johnson coming because he was so big and larger than life. But if you could step back and say, what does this mean? What is the significance, particularly for countries who value democracy, have a common understanding of the truth? And I don't want you to get your glass, ball out and try to predict, but what does it mean, and what do the media need to do now with that happening in our two countries?
My wife is English, so Boris Johnson is an obsession in our household. And Brexit happened around the same time as the Trump election. So, and the synergies between those two events, or similarities, are unmistakable. I'm going to back up and take a run at that question from a long distance. I read a book last year called How Democracies Die, written by a couple of Harvard political scientists, one of whom was a specialist in Europe and the other was a specialist in Latin America. And it's not explicitly a book about Brexit or Trump. It talks about European, it identifies a number of cases, a lot of them in the 1930s, Europe, but more recently Turkey, Venezuela, Hungary, where countries that had democracy lost it. And what are the symptoms of that you should watch for that should cause you concern about your democracy being threatened? And they run through a list, and the list sounds ominously like what's happening not only in the US and UK, but in a number of other places. It's a undermining of the authority of social and civil institutions, including the press, but also including the courts, the opposition political parties. It's a tendency to treat your opponents as illegitimate. He wasn't born here. Lock her up. Anyway, it's a short book and worth a read. And I don't mean to sound apocalyptic about it, but that's, when people ask, what do I worry about? That's what I worry about, that and climate change. That I do think that there's and this is not entirely, Donald Trump is not the author of this state of being, he's the symptom of it. And I don't think I completely understand how you deal with that, except to keep doing what I know how to do.
Can I ask you, do you think that, you mentioned when we started the talk about how everybody missed the Trump's election, everybody projected the opposite. Same thing happened with Brexit, I believe, that right up to the end, the polls suggested Brexit wasn't going to go through. Mm-hmm. Do you think that contributed to a large degree to the skepticism now of the press, because we blew it in those two very major ways, mm-hmm. that it calls to question, first of all, whether we can be trusted, and second of all, did we say things because we thought we wanted them to happen rather than what was really happening?
Yes, I do think that's contributed to our credibility problems. The fact that we didn't see it coming. This is probably not the main reason, but one reason we didn't see it coming was we've become, as an industry, so obsessed with data. There's got to be a metric for everything. There's a poll, there's an economic indicator, there's a trade balance number that will sort of tell you what's going to happen. And I sound like an old fart when I say this, but I sort of yearn for the days when journalists practice something a little closer to anthropology, where you would go out into a neighborhood and not just gather sound bites, but you would sit down with people and really listen to, like aerobic listening
I like that.
to what they had to say, and you'd do enough of that so that you could sort of sense a mood or something amiss in the public consciousness. And I think if there had been a little anthropology done in Wisconsin and Michigan, Pennsylvania, we might have seen this coming.
Any other questions? Well, one more?
By the way, this is an awfully friendly audience for a county that went 350,000 to 300,000 for Trump.
My question is that when I was hired by the Times Radio, XR, in '79, I had to be vetted by the FBI field office in the building. It was a place that had a big medallion on the wall and a couple of FBI agents. What was all that about? Was that Ellsberg residue?
I haven't got a clue. Huh?
The Times had an FBI field office there.
The Times had a field office in the same building as the
The
Times?
FBI, yes.
The FBI had?
I just took the elevator and went upstairs because they wanted to talk to me. You don't know about that?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Sorry, couldn't help.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you all very much. And I want to thank Bill for taking the time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you all for being here. This was an extraordinary evening for us, and we are so grateful to both of you. And to show our appreciation,
Get a tote bag.
we tried to
You get a
figure out
tote
what
bag.
to give
Oh.
people who have everything. We decided on Rogers Memorial Library bags.
Can't have too many tote bags. Thank
We're
you.
supporters of the library.
Thanks again.
Thank
for
you very
coming.
much.
Hope we'll see you again sometime.